And in the presentation, I'm drawing on two main pieces of research. So the underlying primary data include an online survey that was circulated in 2016 via detention volunteer groups that had 132 responses. And I'm also drawing on qualitative interviews with nearly 50 people, including volunteers and activists, NGO workers, lawyers, judges, and people who had experienced immigration detention or bail. I'm going to focus on broad messages in this presentation, but I've popped some links into the chat to more detailed outputs, methods, references, if anyone wants to follow up on that. And I also want to give a kind of disclaimer. I work on different facets of migration and displacement. Unlike many of your speakers and participants, I'm not a social movement specialist, and you'll probably see that, but I'm looking forward all the more to engaging with and benefiting from your perspectives and comments in the discussion. So to start off with some context, bringing down net migration was adopted as a key policy commitment by the Conservative government around a decade ago, and researchers really challenged the rationale for that and issues prompted by the measures that were pursued. But for better or worse, the thrust of policy changes in the last 10 years in the UK has been at refining selection and control, with an emphasis on meeting skilled labour shortages and combating other unwanted migration. So we've got a Byzantine landscape of legislation and policy guidance that people have to navigate in the process of obtaining leave to enter, live and work in the UK. And for people with more precarious immigration status, policymakers have sought to create what they termed a hostile environment as people move through everyday life. They've sought to reduce appeal rights and redouble efforts at enforcing removal. The UK was an early adopter and until quite recently an eager developer of immigration detention facilities. And the backgrounds of people in those facilities really reflect colonial history, they can reflect contemporary global conflict and inequality, and also some increasing scrutiny of EU nationals in recent years. The law permits administrative detention to prevent unauthorised entry or to hold someone with a review to removal. And administrative guidance then directs immigration officers to think about the timescale of removal, risk of people absconding or offending, among other factors, when they make the decision to detain someone. Around half of people in detention are asylum seekers. Now, there's a really excellent research literature that critically maps out the spatial, temporal logics of detention, how detention sort of disciplines and contains unwanted populations, how people experience that, how they resist within detention centres. And people are also telling those stories directly themselves. In the file that I dropped in the chat, there's a bunch of links to relevant kind of websites where people are talking about their experiences of detention and also of activism around it. But what I sort of saw around 2016 was a lack of systematic research on wider geographies of resistance outside detention. And I'd certainly found joining a visiting group for a brief period a pretty sort of intense and thought-provoking experience. And I thought that given detention functions to contain people and to exclude them from wider society, any effort to cut across that is quite interesting. In 2016, we counted some 40 groups across the UK that were working in a significant way on detention. Now, of course, levels of institutionalisation have varied greatly. You've got really established NGOs, you've got informal groups operating out of people's living rooms. And their goals and their ways of working also vary. Some people would describe themselves and identify as activists, others as members, supporters, volunteers, and so on. So UK politicians frequently point to negative public opinion polls on immigration, but a closer look shows quite a wide and a shifting spectrum of attitudes, and also a long history of pro-migrant mobilisation, including around detention. So I wanted to better understand people's involvements, these involvements by members of the public at this kind of hard end of the immigration regime. And really to start at the micro level to think about how do people make sense of those involvements, but then also how do they take action and what impact does that have? So the conceptual literature I was reading around social movements and volunteering points us to investigating how do people identify a cause for concern in the sense of the need to defend or promote worthwhile values. It also highlighted how personal factors relating to people's life situations, experiences, beliefs, dispositions, connections might have a bearing on people's mobilisation. And how do opportunities for meaningful action present themselves? Questions around resource mobilisation, around political processes that might open up or narrow down opportunities for change, about organisational framings that connect causes for concern with particular sort of modes of action. So I'd like to start off by thinking about how people understood and kind of talked about the cause for concern that they were addressing when thinking about detention. How did they articulate that? And I think that this young person in the first quote here captured some really common sentiments. So she said, I just remember having to get my head around it. These people hadn't committed a crime, they were being kept in a prison, could be kept for years, didn't have massive media coverage at the time, kind of secret. I think we can unpack that a bit, starting with that reference to crime in prison. So many people raise concerns about this administrative nature of immigration detention. So if someone doesn't have permission in the UK to live in the UK, then the official response should be regularisation or removal. But on the way to removal, the law also allows immigration officers to detain people. Now, we have seen a growing criminalisation of immigration infractions and a growing focus on the deportation of former criminal offenders. So it can be quite easy to confuse the issue. But the decision to take someone into immigration detention is being made on administrative rather than criminal grounds. And that doesn't sit right with a lot of people. Historically, migrant internment was used primarily in times of war, but over the last 30 years, it's become normalised. And what's more, in terms of procedure, unlike in Portugal, where I think detention decisions have to be validated by a judge within 48 hours, and in those links that I sent, there's a great report by the Global Detention Project on immigration detention in Portugal. In the UK, there's no automatic judicial oversight until 4 months, although individuals can apply for bail before then. In the quote, she also notes that people can be kept for years. So the indefinite nature of detention was a major preoccupation among a lot of people mobilising. The UK opted out of the EU returns directive's limit on detention of 6 and exceptionally 18 months. I think in Portugal, there seem to be time limits of 60 and exceptionally 90 days. The UK has no statutory time limit. Rather, it instructs immigration officers to use detention, quote, for the shortest period necessary where there is a realistic prospect of removal within a reasonable period. But how do we assess the probability and the timescale of removal? Predictions don't appear to be particularly accurate. There have been some very lengthy detentions. On all of the people leaving, of all the people leaving detention in 2018, only 1/3 were removed within a month of detention. Participants' accounts also flagged concern for the significant suffering that the system engenders, trauma, family separation, including sometimes from British-born children, instances of abusive treatment by officers, and instances of suicide and self-harm. Another cause for concern some cited were the inconsistencies that arise between policy and practice around the problems of getting effective access to health review and to legal aid. Now, quite often people's accounts were sort of placed detention also in wider frames, so they criticised the immigration system more generally, for example, for generating irregularity by failing to align with structural demand for low-skilled migrant labour, or for the well-documented bureaucratic culture of disbelief, which meets people seeking asylum. And there's a kind of a feeling of national hypocrisy that was touched on in that second quote. Or they pointed to broader patterns of post-colonial and neoliberal exploitation, conflict, inequality that underpin global migration patterns. Now, there were, of course, nuances in the things that preoccupy people. So, for example, some people are particularly exercised by bureaucratic inconsistencies, others by deprivation of liberty, others by racism and global structural inequality. But most people I surveyed favoured ending detention and a more open approach to immigration. And that, of course, is a big contrast with opinion polls suggesting at the time most of the UK public believed that immigration should be reduced. But it's consistent with evidence that people's encounters with the human costs of immigration controls tend to unsettle restrictive preferences. And drawing on Levinas, Gill, Malky and others who kind of explore this kind of thing, there was often a real sense of a sort of striking ethical encounter. I think that comes across a bit in the first quote. That sense of a collapsing moral distance and a duty to take action. But people don't experience these ethical encounters as abstract moral beings. I also want to pull out a few observations about how personal factors might be playing in. So there was a clear element of what social movements theorists call biographical availability, having time. Many participants were at a point in their lives, often they were either in their 20s or they were retired or moving towards retirement, where they had fewer or more flexible responsibilities. They were markedly highly educated compared with the national average, and also actually compared with national surveys of volunteering in general. And many were relatively secure in socioeconomic terms and felt a sense of moral responsibility that they linked with that. Many detention volunteers and activists are white, but overall there appears to be more diversity in people's ethnicity and backgrounds than in the general population and national volunteering data. Personal or family migration experience was reported as relevant to the motivation of some 40% of the people we surveyed. And the voices of people who have experienced detention, the majority of whom are Black or minority ethnic, are growing stronger through groups in particular like Freed Voices, Movement for Justice, Samfire, that were making a powerful contribution to advocacy for change. Now, for most, detention was kind of part of a broader worldview, a kind of socially engaged stance, and they had prior or concurrent involvements in human rights, anti-racism, community organising of various kinds. And most of the survey respondents described themselves as left of centre politically. And there were other factors that I'd be happy to chat about later. But how does this feed into action? I think first there's the level of supporting individuals, with groups of volunteers would arrange visits, phone calls to talk with people detained, try to support them in various practical ways. And they talked a lot about the pleasure of building those relationships, of acquiring skills, knowledge, and also a sense of perspective through that process. But clearly it can also be time-consuming, awkward, and emotionally demanding work. And they had a lot of interesting reflections on the interpersonal and the organisational politics involved, how people navigate race, class, gender politics involved in visiting detention centres, how organisations navigated a kind of a risk of being co-opted into legitimising the system as they try to maintain and improve their access to detention centres. Now, the impact of that kind of work is obviously felt at an individual level by people who are in sore need of an ally on the outside, someone to talk to or to help locate key documents, find a solicitor, and so on. But the existence of visiting programmes also provides important information on the challenges that people are encountering in ways that can feed into wider governance forums and campaigns for change. So second, in terms of taking action, campaigns for change have crystallised around a number of goals. The ending of detention of people deemed vulnerable, the improving of legal safeguards, particularly through imposition of a time limit, use of alternative mechanisms of immigration control instead of detention, and long-standing calls to end detention outright. And they use a range of different kinds of approaches that you'll be familiar with. There have been some divergences on goals and approaches, particularly, for instance, around abolition as a goal, around the methods, the role of big demonstrations as a method of campaigning and kind of protest. But thinking about, I was listening to Donatella Della Porta's observations about momentum in a previous seminar. So thinking about kind of the mass and velocity of social movements, I think we can say that both sort of separate campaigns and a conscious search for a common ground have created a growing sense of momentum in recent years. So I've already talked about the growing voices of people who've experienced or are at risk of detention. While there have been long campaigns around specific detention centres, those are kind of connecting now with wider spaces. There's a These Walls Must Fall campaign that's working to mobilise support in key cosmopolitan cities from which people get detained, and mobilising support from communities, councils, trade unions and so on to change the system. Ways of networking, alliances, publicity have grown. Detention Forum and the Association of Visitors to Immigration Detainees bring together voluntary sector groups. Professional, medical and legal organisations have weighed in with big reports and concerns in recent years. And there's international coalitions that connect the UK movement to movements for change in other parts of Europe and further afield. And we've had a sort of whole sequence of hard-hitting media exposés that means that now what goes on in detention is really no longer secret, as that first activist said. The government has faced over the last few years a real barrage of concern from UN inspectors, observers to its own inspectors that have raised the parliamentary profile of the issue, that have fuelled cross-party support for change. And all major opposition parties now pledge reforms, including ending indefinite detention. In 2018, the Windrush scandal, which I can talk about later if you like, hit the headlines big time, and it's thought that in the course of that, around 100 people were detained unlawfully. Last year, the Home Affairs Select Committee report decried the Home Office, which is responsible for detention, decried its shockingly cavalier attitude and found problems with almost every aspect of the detention system. So there's been a real barrage of critique. And in the face of that pressure, the government does seem to have started to move somewhat. It began talking about detention reform, and key themes were keeping detention to a minimum and introducing more systematic safeguards and support for the vulnerable. So let's think about keeping detention to a minimum, and we can look at some numbers. So I hope you can see all four graphs there, yeah? Okay. So it's clear that after 3 decades of expansion, there's recently been a noticeable decline in the detained population. The government is detaining fewer people at any one time. It's detaining somewhat fewer people over the course of a year. And there are fewer detentions lasting more than a month. That's above that middle segment. So does that add up to evidence that detention is being used sparingly and just prior to removal? Well, people leaving detention because they've been removed are at the bottom grey segment in that last graph. And that's declined as a proportion of people leaving detention to 37% last year. The majority of people leaving detention are actually being released into the community, either by the Home Office or a judge. Now, that's not to say that they might not later be detained and removed, but the fact that only a minority of detentions leads directly to removal just by itself rather begs the question of whether those detentions should be taking place in the first place. So thinking about those kind of reform goals around minimising detention, so you've got fewer people in detention, fewer long detentions, reduced bed spaces, closing 2 centres in recent years, a tendency to try and consolidate capacity around Heathrow Airport, but the majority still being detained without removal. And in the year ending March 2019, there were 312 proven cases of wrongful detention, for which 8.2 million compensation was paid out by the government. And that's with quite variable access of detainees to legal assistance. No clear reduction targets have been set. There's no statutory time limit as yet, although the government stated last year that it was looking closely at the question. What about the release situation for people who are released from detention? There's been some small-scale piloting of alternatives projects, but the main alternative seems to be the government just releasing people. Some people get state accommodation, many people live with relatives or friends, rely on charity, or become destitute if they've got no recourse, if they've not got the right to work or any recourse to public funds. So they're not deprived of liberty anymore, but they join the larger migrant population in precarious situations in the community. There's also a question here that's kind of coming to the fore more recently around churn. Although there are no statistics on redetention, anecdotally, some NGOs are quite concerned that people are being released and then getting redetained in a kind of a back and forth dynamic. So moving to the other kind of area that was flagged for reform, which was more systematic safeguards and support for the vulnerable. In the face of really heartbreaking evidence about the damage that detention can do, an adults at risk policy was introduced with the aim of ensuring fewer vulnerable people are detained, and when they are, it's for shorter periods of time. So the policy provided an expanded list of categories of people deemed at risk of harm in detention, but at the same time it adopted a narrow definition of torture, which is torture survivors being a key category of people who you might have some concerns about as regards detention. And there's been a lot of back and forth in the courts over this. The adults at risk policy also introduced a really rigorous calibration of evidence of vulnerability. I could go into more detail in the discussion, but basically organisations like Medical Justice and others have shown that it's a real uphill struggle to get that kind of evidence if you're in a detention centre. And even if you can get that evidence, it's balanced with what they term immigration control factors, so absconding or offending risk, which are much less clearly calibrated in terms of sort of levels of evidence, and often much less clearly evidenced in court. A lawyer at the Immigration Law Practitioners Association commented that vulnerability has become a term of art for the Home Office. Some do suggest that the new policy has resulted in more, not less, vulnerability in detention. And a recent inspection was also pretty damning. Okay, so then there was the pandemic. Now the official line here has been that there is no plan to have a wholesale systematic release from our immigration removal centres. That was a statement for government around the 18th of March. Nevertheless, COVID-19 has kind of turbocharged that reduction that was already happening in detention. Around 700 people were released in 1 week, leaving a similar number still detained in prisons and removal centres. And legal action played a key role in putting, sort of ramping up the pressure on this. There was the question legally of removability. Global travel restrictions were preventing removal to many, I think it was sort of around 50 countries at the time of this key court case in late March, including Jamaica, Afghanistan, places that are high deportation destinations from the UK. Then there was the public health question, and detention centres were chillingly described by a public health expert as epidemiological pumps. While few detainees are over 50, it was recognised that people with clear health vulnerabilities like asthma should be considered level 3, so the highest level under the adults at risk policy. So a lot of people have been released on those grounds, but clearly not everyone. I think what this situation has demonstrated is that there clearly are alternatives to detention, but we also have to think about the situation of people who have been released. Some people were able to access state accommodation. A lot of people were able to find somewhere to live with friends or with family or through charitable help. But there's also lots of evidence of destitution. There was an everyone in policy whereby local authorities were required to find accommodation in empty hotels and so on for people who were destitute, who were on the rough sleepers in particular. And amazing things have happened, but there's a lot of evidence that destitute migrants who don't have recourse to public funds were falling through that net. So, and also major questions about the ending of various forms of support later this month. As countries like Jamaica open up for flights, we may find that this reduction was actually a kind of a temporary effect of the lockdown. The bed spaces are still there. The Home Office has tried to lean on the judiciary to ask it to moderate its grants of bail. And indeed, the more people slip into precarious status because of COVID and the economic effects of lockdown, it's possible that people will become targets for detention. So this radical downsizing of detention has become sort of one of the silver linings of lockdown, if you like, and it's reinforced the impossibility of engaging differently with people who are struggling in the immigration process. But whether that effect gets locked in, if you like, as a societal shift is entirely a different question. So on my final slide, I just wanted to kind of flag up and finish with some thoughts about key features of current and the future campaigning landscape. And here I'm drawing heavily on insights from panelists at a discussion I chaired on winning the fight against immigration detention as part of Oxford Refugee Week a couple of weeks ago. Detention activists have a long history of mobilising across physical restriction. So practical, individual work of the kind I talked about continues. Visits have been banned, but visiting groups have been maintaining contact with people in detention by phone, and community groups have been helping to arrange accommodation for people applying for bail in lockdown and so on. Now, a previous seminar, the Donatella de la Porta's seminar, mapped out the ways that protest repertoires are going online and adapting around the current context. Distance demonstrations, virtual rallies, and so on, and detention activism in making use of those kinds of methods. There are challenges to maintain momentum online and across the digital divide, which research suggests might pose obstacles to older volunteers and people in precarious immigration and economic situations, both of whom are a vital part of the detention movement. But I've witnessed at the same time some very nimble engagements by exactly those groups in online activism in recent weeks. So there is that sense of a momentum, I think, being maintained. Alliances seem vital, and I've got 3 examples of this. First one relates to parliamentary mathematics, if you like. We've got a large Conservative majority in Parliament. Cross-party support is going to be vital to secure any legislative change. Conservatives have tended to highlight rule of law concerns around detention, and the current amendment for a time limit of 28 days and increased judicial oversight, which has been tabled by a Conservative Member of Parliament, seems to have a lot of potential. It seems to have wide appeal. It came close to succeeding in the last Parliament, actually. And these measures, if passed, would really put the onus on public authorities to be more careful in decisions and more diligent in processing the cases of people in detention. And as Donatella said in her seminar, the pandemic is facilitating various kinds of frame bridging, if you like. There are strong connections with the heightened public awareness of structural racism following the death of George Floyd, this surge in Black Lives Matter activism, and also concerns about the vulnerability of Black and minority ethnic population to COVID-19 in the UK, and the high profile at the moment of minority and migrant National Health Service workers too. People have reminded us that Jimmy Mabenga, the Angolan deportee who died during his deportation, was also crying, "I can't breathe," to the G4S guards that were restraining him. So there's a lot of opportunities to connect up these issues with things that are concerning people in the present context and more broadly. So we're seeing a coming together of activism in some other ways too. Heathrow has reportedly got the largest detention facility in Europe. The government was planning to build a mega centre in conjunction with the building of a 3rd runway, but detention and environment campaigners have been joining forces in opposing that. So you're seeing a diversification of alliances across racism, detention, climate change activism, and so on in really interesting ways. I think a key kind of question in upcoming months will be this kind of question of crimmigration, this eliding of the criminal and immigration fields. By the start of May, the vast majority of immigration detainees had served a criminal sentence prior, and who were still in detention. And the Home Office was arguing that they posed a risk of harm. Charities have shown that this is often quite poorly set out in evidence, and often people are actually released when taken to a judge. Arguably, immigration detention on top of a criminal sentence, on top of anticipated deportation, could be seen as a triple punishment. But then again, foreign national offenders are also one of the most demonised groups in society. So how can that immigration dynamic be addressed? How can campaigners improve the understanding of diverse situations that led people to a criminal sentence and detention? And how much do campaigners want to be grappling with that and trying to unpack it? And a final comment just on the wider post-pandemic context and the anticipated economic depression that we're all facing. There already are taxpayer concerns about the cost of the detention estate. The daily cost per detainee seems to be around £95, and those kinds of concerns are likely to increase. The economic situation is also likely to have far-reaching consequences for migration patterns. There's been a massive dampening and migration politics, and it's too early really to say what direction that's headed in. I think the time limit campaign will hopefully succeed this time. It's an important kind of immediate improvement, and it's the culmination of years of careful work by campaigners sort of shifting attitudes on that. But I also wonder if perhaps, as Della Porta suggests, this is that kind of critical juncture for movements to work for more transformative change like ending detention. And this would also be building on a groundswell of grassroots support for this even prior to the pandemic. And the changing politics of migration might represent an opportunity in that respect. Okay, so I've spoken for long enough, but I hope I've given you a bit of a flavour of the detention landscape, mobilisation in the current context. I know probably a lot of you are familiar with detention or familiar with migration or familiar with social movements, and I look forward to hearing your comments and your questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. It was really, really interesting. And really, before opening the floor to questions and answers and also close our recording, I just would like to stress that there are really strong axes of continuity in the last webinars we hosted here. And like this idea of the pandemic also as a critical juncture in which certain features of social movements can be strengthened. The first webinar we hosted in this situation was related to the right to housing in the pandemic times, and all the intervenients stressed this opportunity in the moment of pandemic to strengthen some topic related to housing rights. So the evidence of the crisis of housing was so strong in the pandemic that for some groups of activists, of housing activists, was very strong. The opportunity to push some claims and some reivindications in this context, and so to open in this window of maybe for future transformative changes. That is the concept that you mentioned, which I think is very interesting, this critical juncture for transformative changes. And this is also what Donatella Della Porta mentioned in our more general picture of the current development of social movements and in the current situation, and their role in strengthening some claims and issues. And so I think that now I close the recording and I open the floor.